The alarm on my command deck screamed before I even gave the order. Red light washed over every console, every face, every claw gripping a control panel. I did not flinch. I never flinch. My name is Vexthara Cole, Fleet Commander of the Jarn Dominion 3rd Expansion Fleet, and on that day I gave an order that I believed was ordinary. I was wrong in a way I did not yet understand, and by the time I did understand, it was already too late to take it back. The target on our screens was a station, round, white, quiet. Sensors marked it as a human medical relief platform, orbiting a colony world we intended to claim. It broadcasted no weapons signature. It broadcasted no shields. It broadcasted only a steady, calm identification code, repeating on every frequency we could hear, along with something our translators labeled as a distress signal. My tactical officer, a sharp young Jarn named Threll, looked up at me from his station. "Commander, the station is unarmed. Civilian markings confirmed. Should we adjust the strike pattern?" I did not hesitate. In the Dominion, hesitation was a weakness carved out of officers early, usually the hard way. "Strike as planned," I said. A message to the colony below. "Let them see what waits for those who resist us." The order went out. Our cruisers fired. The station broke apart in silence, because sound does not travel in the vacuum of space. Only light, only heat, only the slow tumbling wreckage that used to be walls and beds and machines, meant to heal instead of harm. I remember thinking, in that moment, that it was simply Tuesday, just another campaign, just another world to add to the long list of worlds the Dominion had folded into its hunger. I did not know the word hospital carried a different weight to the species we had just angered. I did not know that somewhere far away, on a green and blue world called Earth, a very old and very patient civilization was about to stop being patient. For 3 days after the strike, everything proceeded exactly as our doctrine predicted. The colony surrendered its outer defenses. Refugee ships tried to flee and were turned back or destroyed. Standard procedure, nothing personal, simply the mechanics of conquest. I filed my after-action report. Command sent back a commendation. My officers celebrated with strong drink and louder stories. I did not celebrate. I do not know why. Perhaps some old instinct, buried under decades of following commands without question, was already trying to warn me. On the 4th day, the silence began. Not the silence of victory, not the quiet of a beaten enemy licking its wounds. A different kind of silence, one I had never encountered in 20 years of campaigns across a dozen star systems. Human colonies near the border, colonies we had been monitoring for months, colonies full of arguments and broadcasts and messy, chaotic civilian noise, simply stopped talking. Not destroyed, not damaged, just gone dark, all at once, like 1,000 candles pinched out by the same set of fingers. "Explain this," I told my intelligence officer, a calm and careful woman named Cyril, who had never once given me a wrong report in 6 years of service. She looked troubled, which was rare for her. "Commander, our listening posts show no attack, no fleet movement toward these colonies. The humans are evacuating. Civilians first, non-essential personnel second. It is orderly. It is fast. It is nothing like the panic our models predicted." "Predicted panic," I repeated. "Explain why we predicted panic." "Because every species we have encountered panics when their border is struck first, Commander. Panic creates disorder. Disorder creates openings. That is how conquest works. That is how it has always worked for the Dominion." I stared at the star chart on the wall of my command deck. 100 human systems glowing faint blue, most of them now silent. "They are not panicking," I said slowly. "They are clearing a table." Cyril did not answer. I do not think she had an answer. I do not have one either, not yet, but something cold had settled into my chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to doubt. Command dismissed my concerns when I raised them. A senior admiral named Dresk, a Jarn twice my age and 3 times my rank, laughed over the comm channel loud enough that I had to lower the volume. "You worry too much, Vexthara," he said. "The humans are soft, sentimental. Their leaders will bicker over how to respond while we press forward. This silence is confusion, nothing more, take the next colony, show them the same lesson. I obeyed, because that is what fleet commanders do in the Dominion. Obedience was carved into us as deeply as ambition, and the two rarely conflicted, until that week they began to. We pushed our fleet forward, 30 warships strong, toward the next contested system, a modest human mining colony called Ashworth Reach. My scanning officer, a nervous young man named Bex, kept refreshing his sensor sweep every few minutes, as if expecting something to jump out at him from empty space. I told him to stop wasting processing cycles on ghosts. He apologized and kept doing it anyway. I did not punish him for it. Something about his nervousness matched the strange tightness building in my own chest. On the 5th day, our long-range sensors picked up a single vessel entering the outer edge of the system. Just one. I remember the bridge going quiet as the data scrolled across the main display. 30 of our warships, arranged in standard advance formation, against a single unidentified craft. It should have been nothing. It should have been the kind of encounter my crew laughed about afterward over drinks, a lone scout picked off before it could even transmit a warning. But the numbers on the screen did not make sense. "Run it again," I told Bex. He ran it again. The numbers came back the same. Mass readings for the vessel were nearly triple what our largest warships carried. Reactor output measurements were so far beyond our scale that our own instruments flagged the reading as a probable error. Weapon signatures did not match anything in our extensive database, built from decades of studying dozens of species across this arm of the galaxy. "Sensor malfunction," I said, though I did not fully believe it. "I have run diagnostics twice, Commander," Bex said, his voice tight. "The instruments are functioning correctly. The ship is exactly as large and as powerful as the readings suggest." Threll, my tactical officer, leaned forward at his station, studying the shape of the vessel now resolving on our long-range visual feed. It was sleek, dark, unadorned by the kind of aggressive spikes and blades many warships in this region favored for intimidation. It looked almost plain, almost quiet, and somehow that plainness was more unsettling than any menacing silhouette could have been. "One ship," Dresk's voice crackled over the fleet-wide channel, joining our tactical discussion from his own flagship 2 systems away, listening in as senior officers often did during first contact scenarios. 30 of ours against one of theirs. "Vexthara, this is not a battle. This is target practice. Move to intercept and destroy it before it can call for reinforcements." I gave the order because it was, on its surface, sound doctrine. A single vessel, however strange its readings, could not realistically stand against a coordinated fleet of 30 warships. Numbers win wars. That had been true in every engagement of my career. Our fleet adjusted course, spreading into an encirclement pattern designed to cut off any avenue of retreat. I watched the human vessel on my display, waiting for it to flee, to scatter countermeasures, to do anything a rational commander facing overwhelming odds would do. It did none of those things. It held its position at the edge of the system, engines idling at what our sensors read as barely above minimum power, as if it were simply waiting for us. As if our 30 ships closing in around it were not a threat worth maneuvering against. "Perhaps their pilot is a fool," Threll offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Or perhaps," Sorel said quietly from her station, "they are not afraid." I considered ordering an immediate strike, ending the strange standoff before it could develop into something I did not yet understand. But some instinct, the same one that had gone cold and tight in my chest since the silence began, told me to wait, just a moment longer, to see what this single vessel intended to do. It opened a channel. Not a wide broadcast meant to reach every ship in the system, the way distress signals or surrender demands typically worked. A single, narrow channel, directed precisely at my flagship, as if whoever was on the other end knew exactly which vessel carried the fleet's commanding officer. I accepted the transmission against the quiet protest of my communications officer, who reminded me that unknown channels could carry more than words. I told her I understood the risk. I told her I needed to hear this. The voice that came through was human, translated a half-second later by our systems into words I could understand, though something about the tone carried through even the translation, something flat and final that no algorithm could fully soften. One word: confirmed. The channel closed before I could respond. I sat in my command chair, staring at the small dark ship on my display, 30 of my own warships arranged around it, like hunters closing on prey that had not yet realized it was prey, and for the first time in my career, I did not know what to do next. Cyril broke the silence on the bridge. "Commander, what did that mean?" I did not answer her right away, because I did not know, and admitting that felt like admitting something far larger and far more frightening than a simple lack of information. I looked at the star chart again, at the human systems still glowing dark and silent along our shared border, evacuated with a calm efficiency that had never matched our models of panic and disorder. Confirmed, I thought. Confirmed what? I would learn the answer soon enough, and it would change everything I believed about the difference between an enemy who fights out of fear and an enemy who fights because something has already been decided, calmly, without anger, long before the first shot is fired. I gave the order to close the encirclement. 30 ships against 1. I told myself the numbers still made sense. I told myself this was still ordinary. Some very old part of me, buried deep beneath decades of discipline and doctrine, already knew that nothing about this day was going to be ordinary again. The single word echoed in my mind long after the channel closed. Confirmed. Not a threat, not a plea, a confirmation, delivered the way a technician confirms a reading on an instrument panel, calm and procedural, as if the fate of 30 warships and everyone aboard them had already been calculated, filed, and accepted before we had even finished forming our attack pattern. I ordered my fleet to hold position rather than close the final distance immediately. Some instinct told me that whatever waited on the other side of that encirclement deserved one more moment of caution before I committed my ships to open engagement. Dresk's voice crackled back over the fleet channel almost immediately, impatient, dismissive, the voice of a commander who had never once doubted the strength of Dominion numbers. "Why do you hesitate, Vexthara? 1 ship, 30 of ours. End this and continue toward the colony." I did not answer him right away. My eyes were fixed on the tactical display, on the strange dark vessel sitting almost motionless at the heart of our formation, patient in a way that made my chest tighten further with every passing second. Around me, my bridge crew worked in careful silence, running scan after scan, each result stranger than the last, each result quietly ignored by the part of my mind that still wanted to believe this would end the way every other engagement of my career had ended. "Hold formation," I finally said. "I want full sensor sweeps before we commit. I want to know exactly what we are facing." "You are wasting time," Dresk snapped. "Fear does not become you, Commander." I did not think it was fear. I have turned that moment over in my mind many times since, and I still do not think it was fear. Not yet. It was something closer to recognition, the same instinct a small creature feels in tall grass moments before it understands that the shape watching it is not simply another small creature. I had spent my career hunting weaker species across 100 worlds. I did not yet know what it felt like to be the hunted one, but some part of me was already beginning to learn. Bex's voice cut through the quiet, tight with something between confusion and alarm. "Commander, I am reading a second contact." "Location," I said immediately. "Same position as the first vessel," he said, his hands moving quickly across his console. "I do not understand this reading, Commander. It appears the ship has not moved at all, but our sensors are now detecting an entirely different configuration, as if the vessel has changed shape." I leaned forward in my command chair, put it on the main display. The image resolved slowly, our systems struggling to render whatever they were now detecting. The sleek, plain hull I had studied moments earlier had not physically changed, but something around it had. A faint shimmer, barely visible even to our most sensitive instruments, outlined a shape far larger than the vessel itself, as though the ship carried something folded inside it, something now beginning to unfold. "Explain this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Cyril answered this time, her voice quiet with the particular calm she reserved for reports she did not want to give. "Commander, I believe that is not a second ship. I believe it is a deployment. Something is emerging from within the vessel." I thought of every ship design in our extensive Dominion archives, built from decades of cataloging the war technology of every species we had encountered along our expansion. None of them carried internal deployment systems on this scale. None of them needed to, because none of them had ever needed to hide their true capability behind a plain, quiet hull. They were never showing us their real ship, Threll said slowly, understanding arriving in his voice at the same moment it arrived in mine. That vessel was a shell, a container. I did not have time to fully process the implications of that realization before the shimmering shape around the human vessel resolved fully into focus, and every alarm across my bridge began sounding at once. What emerged was not larger than our entire fleet combined, though it certainly could have been mistaken for such at first glance. It was something else entirely, something our threat assessment systems could not properly categorize because it did not match any known classification in our records. Long, dark, layered with what our scanners struggled to identify as weapon housings, sensor arrays, and structures our translators simply labeled unknown, 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 over and over across the display. Fleet-wide alert, I said, my voice finally betraying the urgency I had been holding back. All ships, prepare defensive formation immediately. Belay that order, Dresk's voice cut across the channel, sharp with irritation rather than alarm, because he had not yet seen what my bridge was seeing. We do not retreat from a single target, regardless of its size. Converge and destroy it before it can bring that mass to bear. I wanted to argue. Some instinct screamed at me to pull my fleet back, to reassess, to understand fully what we were facing before committing another single ship to this engagement. But 20 years of Dominion discipline held firm even as my instincts rebelled against it, and I gave the order to converge, watching my 30 warships tighten their formation around a target that no longer looked anything like prey. The first weapons discharge from the human vessel did not look like anything in our combat archives. No visible projectile, no energy beam matching any signature we had ever catalogued, simply a ripple across space itself, and then one of our escort cruisers on the outer edge of our formation went dark on my display, its systems reading total failure within less than 2 seconds of the discharge. "Report," I demanded, though some part of me already understood what the silence from that cruiser meant. "All systems offline," Beck said, his voice shaking now despite his training. "I am reading no response from the vessel at all, Commander. It is not damaged. It is simply gone dark." 30 ships had become 29, and the human vessel had not moved from its position, had not raised shields, had not deployed a single countermeasure against our approaching formation, because it had not needed to. Whatever it had just done to my cruiser had cost it nothing at all. I sat very still in my command chair, watching the tactical display, understanding with a slow and terrible clarity that the single word transmitted to me only minutes earlier had not been a threat, and had not been a boast. It had been exactly what it sounded like, a confirmation. A calm, procedural acknowledgement that whatever calculation had determined our fate had already been completed, long before we ever saw this ship unfold into what it truly was, long before we had ever given the order that started this entire chain of events. Back on a quiet white station that broadcasted nothing but a steady identification code and a distress signal that none of us had thought worth understanding. I thought, in that strange suspended moment before the true engagement began, of the phrase that had settled cold and heavy in my chest since the silence first fell over the human border colonies. They are not panicking. They are clearing a table. I finally understood what they were clearing the table for. The order to converge had already been given, and 29 Dominion warships continued closing on a single human vessel that had just erased one of our cruisers without so much as raising a shield in its own defense. I opened a fleet-wide channel, my voice carrying to every ship still moving forward under my command, and for the first time in my career, I heard something in my own words that sounded uncomfortably close to a warning rather than an order. "All ships," I said, "prepare for an engagement unlike anything in our training." None of them yet understood what I meant. I was not entirely certain I understood it myself, but somewhere beneath the discipline and the doctrine that had shaped my entire career, an old and simple truth was beginning to surface, one that every species eventually learns the hard way when it mistakes a quiet, patient civilization for a weak one. The silence had never been confusion. The silence had been a decision, made calmly, and carried out without anger. exactly the way the single word transmitted to my flagship had promised it would be. Confirmed. I did not yet know everything that word had confirmed. I would learn soon enough, in ways that would end my career, end the lives of officers I had commanded for years, and end forever the comfortable certainty that the Dominion's strength could not be matched by any species we encountered. For now, I watched the human vessel hold its position, patient and unmoving, waiting for 29 warships to finish closing the distance it clearly did not fear at all. The battle that followed did not resemble any engagement recorded in Dominion history, and it began the moment our lead cruisers came within what our tactical officers estimated as effective weapons range, though I would soon learn that estimate meant nothing at all to the vessel we now faced. Threll gave the order to open fire the instant our systems confirmed target lock, 29 ships releasing coordinated volleys designed to overwhelm a single target through sheer volume, a tactic that had never once failed us in any previous campaign. Energy weapons and projectile batteries lit up the black space between our formation and the human vessel, a storm of firepower that should have, by every calculation in our archives, torn apart anything smaller than a moon. None of it reached the target. A shimmer rippled across the space surrounding the vessel a fraction of a second before our weapons fire arrived, and every shot simply ceased to exist, absorbed or redirected by something our sensors could not properly analyze even after the fact. Serel ran the data 3 times before she was willing to report it aloud. Commander, our entire opening volley failed to register any impact. Whatever defensive system that vessel is using, it does not match any shielding technology in our records. I watched the display in something close to disbelief. 29 ships worth of firepower, simply erased before it ever touched its target, and felt the cold certainty in my chest deepen into something closer to dread. Dresk's voice came through the fleet channel again, no longer carrying its earlier confidence, though he refused to abandon his aggressive posture entirely. "Continue firing," he ordered. "No shield holds indefinitely. Exhaust it." We continued firing. The human vessel did not return fire immediately, as if it were simply waiting, the same patient stillness it had shown from the very first moment it entered the system. I remember thinking, in the strange suspended clarity that sometimes comes during moments of extreme danger, that this waiting was not caution. It was something closer to certainty. Whoever commanded that vessel was not worried about our combined firepower, because they had already calculated, with total confidence, that it could not touch them. When it finally did respond, it did not fire at every ship simultaneously, the way our own doctrine would have dictated. It selected targets with a precision that felt almost personal, beginning with the escort vessels carrying the heaviest weapons payloads in our formation, systematically removing our most dangerous assets first, while leaving lighter, less threatening ships briefly untouched. I watched 3 more of my ships go dark within the span of a few heartbeats, their crews given no warning, no chance to eject, no opportunity to do anything but watch their own systems fail completely under an attack none of us could properly see or understand. I want to be clear that what I witnessed was devastating and swift, but even in that moment, some part of my mind noted something strange. The human vessel was not simply destroying ships in the way our own fleet destroyed enemies, tearing hulls apart in violent, chaotic bursts. It was disabling them, cleanly, completely, as though it possessed both the power to end each vessel entirely and the discipline to choose something more precise instead. "They are not trying to kill everyone aboard," Serel said quietly, almost to herself, though I heard every word clearly over the noise of the bridge. "Commander, look at the disable pattern. Life support signatures remain active on 2 of our lost ships. They are being neutralized, not destroyed." I did not know what to do with that information in the middle of an engagement that was rapidly becoming a slaughter in slow motion, methodical rather than frenzied, more unsettling for its calm precision than any chaotic massacre could have been. 29 ships had become 25, then 22, each loss occurring with the same terrible efficiency, and still the human vessel had not deployed a single fighter craft, had not called for any reinforcement, had not shown the slightest indication that it considered our remaining fleet a genuine threat. Dresk's voice returned to the channel, and for the first time since I had known him, I heard something in his tone that sounded like genuine alarm rather than irritation. Vexthara, status report. What in the void is that thing? I do not know, I admitted, because lying to a superior officer in the middle of a battle that was clearly already lost felt like the smallest of my concerns. Its weapon signatures do not match anything in our archives. Its shielding appears to defeat our entire arsenal without measurable strain. It is selecting targets with precision that suggests full awareness of our fleet composition before the engagement even began. That is not possible, Dresk said. We have maintained strict communication silence throughout this approach. There is no way a single vessel could have gathered that level of intelligence on our formation. I stared at the tactical display, at the calm, patient shape still holding its position at the center of what remained of my fleet, and felt the final piece of understanding settle into place with a clarity that made my chest ache. Perhaps, I said slowly, they did not need to gather intelligence in the way we understand it. Perhaps they simply understood, long before we arrived, exactly what a species like ours would do, and exactly how we would do it. The silence that followed my words stretched long enough that I wondered if the channel had failed. When Dresk finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. Order a full withdrawal, he said quietly, immediately. I gave the order, though some cold certainty in my chest already told me it would not matter. The human vessel allowed our remaining ships to begin their retreat without pursuit, without further attack, watching in patient silence as we scattered away from the encounter that had cost us more than half our fleet, in less time than it took to properly organize a single coordinated volley. It did not chase us. It did not need to. It had already done exactly what it came to do, and I understood, with a growing dread that would not leave me for the rest of that long and terrible day, that whatever this vessel represented was only the very beginning of something our entire dominion did not yet understand it had provoked. We had bombed a hospital, believing it a simple show of force against a soft and sentimental species. I was beginning to understand, as my broken fleet limped away from that patient, unmoving ship, that we had made a mistake far larger than any single tactical error in our long and violent history. We had woken something, and it had not even needed to raise its voice to show us exactly how badly we had misjudged what quiet, patient people are capable of when they decide, calmly and without anger, that a line has been crossed. We limped back to the nearest Dominion outpost with 6 ships out of the 30 that had begun the engagement, and I spent the entire journey standing on my bridge, replaying every second of the encounter in my mind, searching for the moment where I should have understood sooner, where I should have pulled back before losing so many crews to a single vessel that had barely exerted itself. I did not find that moment. I only found a long chain of decisions, each one reasonable within the doctrine I had been trained to follow, each one built on assumptions about a species we had never truly understood. Command received my report with a silence that lasted nearly a full day before any response arrived. When it finally came, it was not from Dresk, whose flagship had been among the vessels lost in the retreat, struck by something our sensors never even registered before its systems failed completely. The response came instead from High Command itself, a rare and unwelcome development that told me, before I even opened the transmission, that the situation had grown far beyond a single failed engagement. Fleet Commander Vexthara Kol, the message began, delivered by a senior strategist named Koraan, whose reputation for patience and precision I had heard about for years, without ever meeting the woman directly. You are to hold position at the outpost and await further instruction. A recovery team will arrive within 2 days to examine any salvageable data from the engagement. Full cooperation is expected. I did not sleep well during those 2 days. I do not think anyone on that outpost slept well, surrounded by the wreckage of a fleet that had been considered more than sufficient for any encounter along this border, now reduced to a handful of damaged ships and a growing list of names belonging to crews who would never return home. The recovery team arrived exactly on schedule, led by a quiet, methodical officer named Threlkin, who had spent most of his career analyzing captured enemy technology rather than commanding warships in open engagement. He requested every scrap of sensor data we had gathered, every recording, every scanned fragment of the human vessel's behavior during the battle, and he requested something else that surprised me at the time, though it would not surprise me for long. "We recovered a damaged escape pod," he told me during our first meeting, his voice carefully neutral in the way officers speak when they are choosing every word with deliberate caution. "It appears to have drifted from the engagement site before your fleet withdrew. It belongs to the human vessel." I felt something tighten in my chest at those words, a mixture of dread and an intense, almost desperate need to understand what we had actually faced. "Survivors?" I asked. "One," Threlkin said. "Badly injured, but stable. She has not spoken since recovery, though our medical staff confirm she is conscious and aware." I requested permission to observe the interview, and against what I suspect were his better instincts, Threlkin allowed it. The human woman sat in a secure medical bay 2 days later, her injuries treated by our own physicians, despite the obvious tension in the room, her eyes calm in a way that unsettled me more than any hostility could have. Her name, according to the identification we recovered, was Ellen Marsh, a systems officer aboard the vessel we had engaged. She looked younger than I expected, though I understood by then how little our expectations about this species had matched reality in every possible way. Threlkin began the questioning carefully, through a translator device, calibrated for human speech patterns, his tone respectful in a manner I had rarely heard him use with any prisoner in his long career. "Can you tell us the designation of your vessel?" he asked. Ellen Marsh studied him for a long moment before answering, her voice steady despite her visible injuries. "It doesn't have a designation you'd recognize as a warship name," she said. "It's classified under civilian protection protocols. We call it a response unit." I stepped forward slightly, unable to hold back the question that had been building in me since the battle ended. "A response unit," I repeated. "That single vessel destroyed more than half of a fleet built for full-scale planetary conquest. What exactly does your species consider a genuine warship, if that was merely a response unit?" Something crossed her expression that I struggled to interpret at the time, though I understand it now as a mixture of exhaustion and something close to sorrow rather than pride. "That ship wasn't built for conquest," she said. "It wasn't even built primarily for combat. Its main function is medical evacuation and disaster response along contested borders. It carries defensive systems because the borders it operates near are dangerous, but its crew are mostly doctors, engineers, and support staff. The commander who engaged your fleet was not a war commander. She was a rescue coordinator." The room went very quiet. I remember Threlkin glancing at me, some of his careful composure slipping for just a moment, before he turned back to Ellen Marsh. "You are telling us," he said slowly, "that a rescue vessel, crewed primarily by medical personnel, destroyed 24 Dominion warships without sustaining any meaningful damage in return." "I'm telling you exactly that," she said. "And I want you to understand something, because I don't think either of you fully grasps what you've actually started. That ship you fought was not sent to punish you for attacking a colony, or a fleet, or a military target. It was sent because you attacked a hospital. Our people draw a very specific line around that. It isn't a legal line, or a political one. It's older than that. It's the line that decides whether we still consider ourselves people, in the way that matters most to us. When someone crosses that line, our response isn't measured by military strategy. It's measured by how much restraint we're willing to set aside." I thought of the numbers scrolling across my sensor display during the engagement, mass and power readings so far beyond our own fleet's capability that our instruments had initially flagged them as errors, and felt a cold understanding settle over me. "If a rescue vessel carries that much capability," I said quietly, "what does your actual military carry?" Ellen Marsh looked at me directly for the first time since the interview began, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no cruelty, only a tired, honest weight that felt somehow heavier than open hostility would have. "I don't think you want the answer to that question," she said. "I think you're about to find out anyway, because word of what happened here has already reached people who don't share the restraint that response unit commander did. She gave your fleet a chance to withdraw. She disabled ships instead of destroying every one of them completely. That was mercy, Commander, by our standards. I would not count on the next ship you encounter extending the same courtesy. Threlkin ended the interview shortly after that exchange, escorting Ellen Marsh back to medical containment with an unusual gentleness in his manner that told me he, too, had understood something during that conversation that changed how he viewed the entire engagement. I remained in the observation room long after they left, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, turning her words over in my mind again and again. Mercy. That was the word she had used to describe an attack that had cost us more than half our fleet in minutes. I had spent my entire career believing overwhelming force was the clearest expression of strength a species could offer. I was beginning to understand that restraint, deployed by a species capable of far greater destruction, was a far more unsettling display of power than anything our doctrine had ever prepared me to recognize. Reports began arriving from other border outposts within days, each one describing a pattern that mirrored our own engagement with unsettling consistency. Single human vessels, never announced, never accompanied by any larger fleet, arriving at contested systems and systematically disabling Dominion forces stationed there, always with the same clinical precision, always avoiding total destruction, where total destruction was clearly within easy reach. Command's confusion turned quickly into something closer to organizational panic, though it never manifested as the chaotic disorder our own doctrine predicted for a defeated enemy. Officers who had spent decades planning campaigns based on numerical superiority now found themselves studying reports that made no logical sense within any framework they understood. I was called before a full council of senior Dominion strategists 3 weeks after my own engagement, expected to explain in detail everything I had witnessed and everything Ellen Marsh had told us during her interview. The council chamber was full when I arrived, senior officers from every major fleet along our expanding border, seated in tiered rows around a central platform where I stood to deliver my report. I recognized several faces from other engagements, each one carrying the same haunted, disbelieving expression I suspected my own face carried as well. Commander Vextara Kol, the presiding strategist, began, an older Jarn named Vorash, whose reputation for cold, careful calculation had shaped Dominion expansion policy for over a decade. You engaged what the humans themselves describe as a non-military response vessel and lost more than half your fleet in the process. Explain how this is possible. I delivered my report as clearly and honestly as I could, describing the shielding technology our weapons could not penetrate, the precise targeting that had systematically removed our most dangerous assets first, the calm, unhurried pace of an engagement that never once resembled panic or desperation on the human side. When I finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment before Vorash spoke again. And this vessel was crewed primarily by medical personnel, he said, his tone carrying none of the disbelief I expected, only a grim, resigned understanding that told me he had already heard similar reports from other outposts along the border. According to the survivor we recovered, yes, I said. She described it as a response unit, designed for evacuation and disaster relief rather than combat. She indicated that our actual engagement with human military forces has not yet occurred. A murmur ran through the assembled officers, quickly silenced as Vorash raised a hand. Then let me ask the question every officer in this chamber is now asking privately, he said. If this is what a rescue vessel is capable of, what exactly have we provoked by attacking their border? I did not have an answer for him, and I do not believe anyone else in that chamber had one either. What I did have, gathered from Ellen Marsh's careful, exhausted words during our interview, was a growing understanding that our entire framework for measuring strength had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what we were dealing with. We had assumed technological superiority meant open aggression, loud displays of power meant to intimidate rivals into submission. We were only now beginning to understand that a species could hold overwhelming capability in complete reserve, deploying only the minimum force necessary to address a specific violation, and that this restraint itself represented a far more dangerous kind of strength than anything our own doctrine had ever cultivated. There is something else, I said, before the council could move on to other matters. The survivor indicated that the response we experienced was considered restrained, even merciful, by human standards. She suggested that further engagement with actual military assets would not carry the same restraint. The silence that followed my words stretched long enough that I began to understand, with a growing dread that would not leave me for a long time afterward, that every officer in that chamber was quietly calculating the same terrible question. If this was mercy, what exactly would follow once mercy was no longer extended? In the weeks that followed the council meeting, I was reassigned to a support role at the very outpost where our shattered fleet had limped home, stripped of active command, while a formal review of the engagement continued. I did not resent this decision. Some part of me welcomed it, grateful for a reason to step back from a war I no longer understood how to fight, though I remained close enough to the flow of information that I watched everything unfold with a kind of horrified attention I could not look away from. The pattern that Ellen Marsh had warned us about began to take shape with a speed that left even our most experienced strategists struggling to keep pace. Human vessels arrived at contested systems along the entire length of our shared border, never in overwhelming numbers, never announced with the kind of dramatic fleet movements our own doctrine would have favored. They arrived quietly, methodically, and where they encountered resistance, that resistance ended quickly, without the prolonged, grinding campaigns that had characterized every previous Dominion conflict. What unsettled our command structure most was not the efficiency of these engagements, though that alone would have been enough to shake decades of confident doctrine. It was the complete absence of anything resembling anger in how the humans conducted themselves. Intercepted communications, painstakingly translated by our linguistic specialists, revealed no triumphant declarations, no demands for unconditional surrender, delivered with the kind of theatrical menace our own commanders favored when addressing defeated enemies. Instead, the messages were procedural, almost bureaucratic in tone, informing local Dominion garrisons of specific terms for withdrawal, timelines for compliance, and clear consequences for continued aggression, delivered with all the emotional weight of a technician reading equipment specifications. I remember reviewing one such transmission during my administrative duties at the outpost, intercepted from a human vessel that had just secured a contested mining system 3 sectors from where my own engagement had taken place. The message was addressed to the ranking Dominion officer at that location, a garrison commander named Theris, whose forces had attempted, briefly and unsuccessfully, to resist the human vessel's arrival. This system falls within a protected humanitarian corridor, the message read, translated carefully by our systems. Your forces engaged our escort vessel despite multiple warnings transmitted prior to contact. Casualties on your side have been minimized in accordance with our engagement protocols. You are given 72 hours to evacuate all remaining personnel and equipment. Failure to comply will result in a different classification of response. There was no cruelty in the message, no gloating over the garrison's defeat, only a clear, calm statement of fact and consequence. I found myself unable to stop thinking about that phrase, a different classification of response, understanding, with growing dread, that whatever restraint had been extended to Theris's garrison and to my own fleet during our disastrous first encounter existed along a scale we did not yet fully understand, one that could shift dramatically depending on choices Dominion commanders continued to make. High Command attempted, during this period, to open formal diplomatic channels with human authorities, hoping to negotiate terms that would halt the systematic dismantling of our border positions before it spread further into territory the Dominion considered essential to its long-term expansion plans. I was not present for these negotiations directly, but reports of their content circulated widely enough among officers at every level that I learned the details within days of each exchange. The first attempt at diplomatic contact was rebuffed almost immediately, not through hostility, but through a kind of quiet indifference that our diplomatic corps found more frustrating than any outright refusal would have been. A senior Dominion negotiator named Kesseth, a woman known throughout the fleet for her considerable skill in securing favorable terms from dozens of previously conquered species, attempted to open discussions with what our intelligence identified as a regional human coordinating authority. Her initial message, carefully crafted to project both strength and a willingness to negotiate from a position of continued dominion resolve, requested formal terms under which hostilities might cease along the contested border. The response she received, delivered nearly 2 full days later through official human channels, was brief enough that I remember it clearly even now. "We are not interested in negotiating an end to hostilities," the response read. "There are no hostilities from our perspective requiring negotiation. Our forces are conducting a clearly defined humanitarian security operation in response to a specific and documented violation. This operation will conclude when its objectives are met, regardless of any terms your authority wishes to propose." Kesith, according to those who worked alongside her during this period, found the response deeply unsettling, precisely because it refused to engage with the framework of negotiation the Dominion had relied upon successfully for generations. Every previous adversary we had encountered, regardless of their initial resistance, eventually arrived at a negotiating table where terms could be discussed, concessions traded, and a resolution reached that allowed both sides to claim some measure of preserved dignity. The humans, by contrast, did not appear interested in preserving anyone's dignity, our own least of all, because they did not view this as a conflict between equals requiring diplomatic resolution. They viewed it as a security matter, already resolved in principle, awaiting only the practical completion of specific, limited objectives. I began to understand, during this period of enforced administrative distance from active command, that the true danger the Dominion faced was not simply the military capability humanity had demonstrated, considerable as that capability clearly was. The true danger lay in the fact that human command structures did not appear to require anger or hatred or even genuine animosity toward us in order to conduct an effective and increasingly comprehensive response to our initial attack. They were, by every indication our intelligence could gather, simply following established protocol, the same calm, procedural approach that had characterized every communication we intercepted, every engagement our garrisons reported, every diplomatic exchange our negotiators attempted. Word of these developments spread quickly beyond Dominion territory, carried through the same neutral trading networks and independent observer channels that connected dozens of minor species scattered along the border regions our expansion had touched over the years. I learned, through reports gathered by our remaining intelligence assets, that several of these neighboring species, previously cautious allies or uneasy tributaries within the Dominion's broader sphere of influence, had begun quietly reassessing their own relationships with us in light of what humanity's response demonstrated. A trade envoy from a species called the Ithan, small, cautious traders who had maintained careful neutrality throughout most of the Dominion's expansion, delivered a message to our regional administrative office that I read with a growing sense of the wider consequences our initial decision had set into motion. The message, translated through the same networks that had carried news of our engagement across dozens of systems, was brief, but carried an unmistakable shift in tone from previous Ethane communications. "We have observed the response to your engagement with the human species," the message read, "and we wish to reconsider certain trade agreements currently in effect between our peoples. We do not wish to find ourselves associated with actions that draw a response of this nature." I understood, reading that message, that the damage from our initial attack on that quiet white station had already spread far beyond the immediate military consequences we continued to suffer along the border. Every species watching this unfold, whether from cautious distance or direct involvement, was now recalculating their own understanding of what boundaries existed around humanity, boundaries that had apparently never been tested before our own commanders decided a hospital was an acceptable target for a show of force. Dresk, I later learned, had survived the destruction of his flagship during our initial engagement, though he emerged from that experience a changed officer, quiet and withdrawn, in ways that surprised everyone who had known him during his decades of confident, aggressive service. Zichamioni I encountered him briefly during a logistics meeting at the outpost, several months after our shared engagement, and the conversation we had that day remains one of the clearest memories I carry from that entire period. "I keep thinking about the numbers," he told me, his voice lacking every trace of the dismissive confidence I remembered from our earlier exchanges. 30 ships, 24 lost, and that was, according to their own survivor, an act of restraint. I think about it every day, I admitted. We spent decades cataloging every species we encountered by their weapons, their fleet sizes, their aggression in negotiation. Dresk continued, staring at nothing in particular as he spoke. We never developed a way to catalog restraint as a threat. We never imagined a species that could hold this much capability back, deploying only what was necessary, precisely calibrated to the offense committed against them. I do not think our doctrine has a framework for understanding an enemy who fights this way, Vextara. I do not think it ever will. I did not have a response for him that day, and I do not think he expected one. We simply stood together in that quiet logistics office, two officers who had spent their entire careers believing overwhelming force represented the clearest measure of strength a species could offer, now forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that the humans had shown us something far more unsettling. A species capable of overwhelming force that chose, deliberately and consistently, to use only what circumstances required, was a species whose true ceiling of capability we had no way of measuring at all, because they had never once shown us anything close to it. High Command, unwilling to accept that an entire border strategy built over decades could unravel so quickly, authorized one final large-scale operation before the formal review of our engagement had even concluded. I learned of this decision only after it had already been set in motion, informed through the same administrative channels that kept me updated on developments I no longer had any authority to influence directly. The plan, as it was explained to me later by officers who had helped design it, called for a coordinated strike against what our intelligence believed was a human logistics convoy, a supply line supporting the various response units now operating along our border. The reasoning behind the operation was straightforward by traditional Dominion doctrine. If the humans could not sustain their forward operations without adequate supply, disrupting that supply chain would force a withdrawal without requiring another direct engagement against their combat vessels. I argued against the operation when I learned of it, submitting a formal objection through the review board overseeing my case, though I held no illusions that my objection would carry any real weight given my current administrative standing. I wrote, in that objection, that everything we had learned about human command structure suggested they anticipated exactly this kind of response, that their calm, procedural approach to this entire engagement indicated forces prepared for contingencies we had not yet imagined. My objection was noted, filed, and ultimately ignored. The operation proceeded 3 weeks later, a coordinated strike force of 40 vessels, larger than the fleet I had commanded during my own disastrous engagement, targeting what our intelligence identified as a lightly defended supply convoy moving through a border system called Meridian's Rest. I followed the operation's progress through the same administrative channels available to me, watching with a growing dread I could not fully articulate even to myself. The convoy, when our forces arrived, was exactly where intelligence had indicated, moving at a pace consistent with heavy cargo vessels rather than combat-ready warships. Our commanders, emboldened by sensor readings that suggested minimal defensive capability, ordered an immediate assault designed to seize or destroy the convoy before any response could be organized. What followed, according to the reports that reached me afterward, unfolded with a speed and precision that left surviving officers struggling to describe events coherently, even days later. The cargo vessels, it emerged, carried defensive systems disguised beneath their civilian profile, systems that activated the moment our forces committed to their attack pattern. More significantly, a response unit had been shadowing the convoy at a distance our sensors had entirely failed to detect, a vessel similar in configuration to the one I had encountered during my own engagement, though our surviving officers described weapon signatures that suggested an even more advanced classification than what I had faced. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes. Of the 40 vessels committed to the operation, only 9 returned to Dominion territory, and those 9 arrived carrying reports that finally, decisively, ended any remaining institutional confidence that our military doctrine could adapt quickly enough to meet whatever challenge humanity now represented along our border. I read the after-action report from that engagement with a familiar, sinking recognition of patterns I had witnessed firsthand months earlier. Precise targeting that removed the most dangerous assets first, defensive systems that our weapons simply could not penetrate, and, once again, a restraint that our surviving officers found more disturbing than outright destruction would have been, ships disabled rather than annihilated, crews left alive but stripped of any capacity to continue the engagement, as if the response unit commanding that convoy's defense had calculated exactly how much force was required to end our assault, without exceeding whatever threshold governed their continued restraint. High Command's formal review of the border conflict concluded shortly after that engagement, and the conclusions reached were unlike anything in Dominion military history that I had ever studied during my long career. Rather than authorizing further offensive operations, the review board recommended immediate and complete withdrawal from every contested system along the human border, a recommendation that senior leadership, chastened by 2 catastrophic engagements in rapid succession, accepted without the usual lengthy deliberation such significant strategic reversals typically required. I was summoned before the review board myself shortly after this decision, not as an officer facing further disciplinary action, but as someone whose first-hand experience with the Human Response Unit was considered valuable for understanding exactly what our forces had encountered and why our doctrine had proven so thoroughly inadequate to the challenge. I answered every question put to me as honestly as I could, describing not just the tactical details of my engagement, but the strange, unsettling calm that had characterized every human communication I had witnessed, the complete absence of anger or triumph that somehow made the entire experience more disturbing than open hostility ever could have been. "You believe this restraint is genuine?" Vorash asked me during that final session, rather than simply another form of calculated intimidation. I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking of Ellen Marsh's tired, honest expression during our interview, thinking of the procedural, almost bureaucratic tone of every intercepted human communication, thinking of ships disabled rather than destroyed, when total destruction would have cost the humans nothing at all. "I believe it is genuine," I said finally, "and I believe that makes it far more dangerous than any calculated intimidation could be, because it suggests a species that has already decided, as a matter of settled principle rather than tactical advantage, exactly how much force a given violation warrants. We attacked a hospital, expecting a soft, disorganized response from a species we had badly underestimated. What we received instead was a measured, deliberate answer, calibrated with a precision that suggests they have faced this exact calculation many times before, against many different species, and have refined their response into something approaching doctrine of their own. I do not believe we provoked an emotional reaction, counselor. I believe we triggered a protocol, one that likely governs their conduct across every border they maintain, and one that scales in severity according to choices we continue to make." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Vorash studied me with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between grim acknowledgement and something that might have been respect for the honesty of my assessment, however unwelcome its implications remained for everyone gathered in that room. "Thank you, Commander," he said finally. "Your assessment will be included in our final recommendations to High Command." I was released from active duty entirely within weeks of that final hearing, my career effectively concluded not through formal punishment, but through the simple, quiet recognition among my superiors that an officer whose fleet had suffered such catastrophic losses could not credibly return to active command, regardless of how thoroughly the engagement's outcome had ultimately vindicated my early warnings about the nature of the threat we faced. I did not resent this outcome as deeply as I once might have. Something had changed in me since that first engagement, some fundamental shift in how I understood strength and violence, and the true cost of assumptions built on decades of unchallenged doctrine. I spent the following months in a kind of quiet exile at a remote administrative posting, far from the border conflicts that continued, with diminishing intensity, as Dominion forces withdrew from territory we had once believed essential to our continued expansion. It was during this period of quiet exile that I received an unexpected communication, delivered through neutral diplomatic channels, that had begun facilitating limited contact between Dominion administrative offices and human authorities overseeing the now largely concluded border conflict. The communication requested my presence at a formal proceeding, one that human authorities described, through careful translation, as an accountability review, related specifically to the engagement I had commanded during the initial phase of this entire conflict. As I understood, reading that communication, that I was being asked to appear before some manner of human tribunal, though the exact nature and consequences of such a proceeding remained unclear to me, even after consulting with what remained of Dominion diplomatic staff, still attempting to navigate this unprecedented situation. I could have refused. Dominion authorities, still smarting from the losses we had suffered, offered no strong recommendation either way, leaving the decision entirely in my hands. I chose to attend, driven by a need I struggled to fully articulate even to myself, a desire to understand, directly and completely, exactly what kind of species we had provoked, and exactly what judgment they intended to render upon those responsible for the decision that had started this entire chain of catastrophic events. The journey to human space took 11 days aboard a small diplomatic transport, escorted the entire way by a single human vessel that never once demonstrated the overwhelming capability I had witnessed during my own engagement, remaining instead in the quiet, understated posture that I now understood was simply how this species preferred to carry its strength, close at hand, but never displayed unless circumstances required it. A young human officer named Grace Lindley served as my escort and translator throughout the journey, assigned specifically to answer whatever questions I might have and to ensure I understood the proceedings I would soon be attending. She was younger than I expected, perhaps not much older than my own tactical officer Threll had been, though something in her manner carried a weight and steadiness that made her age feel almost irrelevant to how seriously I found myself taking her words. "You seem surprised," she said to me on our third day of travel, catching my expression as I studied the small, unremarkable transport we traveled aboard, so different from the imposing warships the Dominion favored for even routine diplomatic missions. "I expected something larger," I admitted. "Given everything I witnessed during our engagement, I assumed every human vessel would carry similar capability, similarly displayed." Grace smiled, though there was no mockery in the expression, only a kind of patient understanding that I was slowly learning characterized much of how humans approached conversations with those who had so badly misjudged them. "Most of our vessels are exactly what they appear to be," she said. "Transports, research ships, colony support craft, nothing more. The response unit you encountered was built specifically for situations requiring exactly the kind of capability it demonstrated. We don't build every ship to that standard because we don't need to. Most of what we do doesn't require it." "And yet you built it," I said. "You anticipated a need for that level of capability, dedicated specifically to protecting medical and humanitarian operations." "We've learned, across a long history, that not every species respects the same boundaries we do," Grace said, her tone carrying no particular judgment toward me personally, though I felt the weight of her words regardless. "Some species see restraint as weakness, an invitation to test how far they can push before facing consequences. We decided a long time ago that we would rather be prepared to answer that test decisively, on the rare occasions it comes, than abandon the restraint itself in the meantime. It costs us something to maintain forces we hope never to use. We've decided that cost is worth paying." I thought of Dresk's words from our quiet conversation months earlier about our inability to catalog restraint as a threat, and understood, hearing Grace's explanation, exactly how thoroughly that blind spot had shaped every assumption the Dominion carried into this conflict. We had built an empire on the principle that strength must always be displayed to be effective, that any capability held in reserve was capability wasted. Humanity, it seemed, had built something entirely different, a civilization that understood strength could remain quiet, patient, and largely invisible, right up until the exact moment it was needed, deployed then with a precision that made its earlier invisibility all the more unsettling in hindsight. "Can I ask you something?" I said, several hours later, as our transport continued its steady journey deeper into human territory. The response unit that engaged my fleet. Its commander transmitted a single word before the engagement began: confirmed. I have thought about that word every day since. What exactly was being confirmed? Grace was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. I wasn't part of that engagement, she said, so I can't tell you exactly what was in that commander's mind. But I can tell you how our protocols generally work in situations like this. Before any response unit engages, there's a verification process. Confirming the target struck the facility in question, confirming the facility's civilian status and proper identification broadcasts, confirming that appropriate warnings were given and ignored, where applicable. I imagine that word meant all of that had been checked, verified, and found accurate. It meant your fleet's actions had been confirmed as exactly what our intelligence reported them to be. Nothing more dramatic than that, just confirmation that the response about to follow was justified according to our own standards, before a single shot was fired, offered. The simplicity of that explanation struck me harder than any dramatic revelation could have. There had been no emotion in that single word, because there had been no emotion driving the decision behind it, only a careful, deliberate process of verification, ensuring that whatever followed was measured, justified, and consistent with standards the humans held themselves to, regardless of how egregious the provocation might have been. I found myself, for the first time since this entire conflict began, understanding not just the capability we had provoked, but the philosophy underlying it, a philosophy that felt entirely foreign to everything the Dominion had built its expansion upon. We arrived at a human administrative station orbiting a world called New Haven 8 days later, and I remember standing at the observation port of our transport as the station grew larger in view, struck by details that felt strange against everything I had expected from a species I had spent months learning to fear. The station was not imposing in the way Dominion facilities favored, all sharp angles and aggressive silhouettes designed to intimidate. It was, instead, almost gentle in its architecture, curved surfaces and wide viewing windows, gardens visible through several sections that I initially mistook for some kind of tactical display. Before Grace explained, they were simply recreational spaces where station personnel could relax during their off-duty hours. "You garden," I said, unable to fully hide my surprise, aboard a military administrative station. "We garden most places we live," Grace said, amused rather than offended by my evident confusion. "It's good for people, reminds them what they're protecting, I suppose, even in a place built mostly for administrative work." I thought of the sterile, purely functional design that characterized every Dominion facility I had ever served aboard, spaces built exclusively around efficiency and intimidation, with no consideration given to anything resembling comfort or beauty for the officers who occupied them. It struck me, walking through the station's quiet corridors under Grace's escort, that this small detail somehow captured something essential about the difference between our two civilizations, more clearly than any weapon or shield technology could have. Humanity, it seemed, had built something that remained capable of overwhelming force when necessary, while still finding room, even within its military infrastructure, for gardens and gentleness and the small, deliberate comforts of a civilization that had not allowed war to consume every aspect of how it organized itself. The tribunal, when I finally stood before it 2 days later, was nothing like the dramatic proceeding I had anticipated during the long journey to reach this place. It convened in a modest chamber, human officials seated at a simple curved table rather than the elevated, imposing platforms Dominion councils favored, and the proceedings themselves carried the same measured, procedural calm that had characterized every human communication I had encountered throughout this entire conflict. A senior official named Margaret Ashcombe presided over the tribunal, her manner careful and precise as she outlined the proceedings' purpose to those of us gathered, Dominion and human representatives alike, seated in careful arrangement around the chamber's central table. "This tribunal is not a criminal proceeding in the sense your Dominion authorities may be expecting," she explained, her words translated smoothly through the same systems that had facilitated every exchange since my arrival. "We are not here to determine punishment for Commander Vextara Cole as an individual. We are here to establish, formally, and for the historical record, exactly what occurred why it occurred, and what both our species can learn from this engagement moving forward. Commander, you will have the opportunity to provide your account of the decisions leading to the attack on our medical facility, and I want you to understand that honesty here serves your interests far better than any attempt to minimize your role in what happened. I gave my full account over the following hours, describing not just the tactical decisions that had led to the strike on that quiet white station, but the broader doctrine and assumptions that had shaped those decisions. The belief that overwhelming force displayed early in a conflict would break enemy morale before more costly engagements became necessary. The complete failure to understand, or even consider, that a civilian medical facility might represent a boundary far more significant to this particular species than any purely military target could have been. Margaret listened to my entire account without interruption, her expression carefully neutral throughout, though something in her manner suggested she was weighing not just the facts I presented, but the genuine remorse I found myself unable to fully hide as I described a decision I had once considered entirely routine. "Commander," she said, once I had finished, "do you understand now why this particular action provoked the response it did?" I considered the question carefully before answering, thinking of everything I had learned since that first engagement, from Ellen Marsh's tired, honest words during her interview, to Grace Lindley's patient explanations during our long journey together, to the quiet gardens I had walked through aboard a station built for administrative, rather than purely martial purposes. "I believe I do," I said finally. "We treated the destruction of a hospital as a tactical decision, a calculated display of force meant to demoralize an enemy population. I have come to understand that your species draws a line around such facilities that has nothing to do with tactics at all. It is a line that exists to preserve something your people consider essential to remaining who you choose to be, even during conflict. We crossed that line without understanding its significance, and in doing so, we revealed to your species exactly what kind of adversary we were, an adversary willing to target the vulnerable and the healing for the sake of a calculated psychological advantage. I understand now that your response was not born from anger at a military setback. It was born from a recognition that we had shown you something about our own character that demanded an answer, one calibrated not to your fear of us, but to the seriousness of what we had done." Margaret studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That is, as best I can determine, an accurate understanding," she said. "I want to be clear, Commander, that this tribunal's findings will be shared not just with your own Dominion authorities, but with every species along both our borders who observe the consequences of this engagement. We do not do this out of pride or to humiliate your people further. We do it because we believe every civilization capable of crossing that same line deserves clear, unambiguous understanding of what awaits them if they choose to do so. Restraint, Commander, is not an offer we extend indefinitely, regardless of provocation. It is a courtesy we extend until it is no longer warranted, and we would prefer that every species considering conflict with us understands exactly where that boundary lies before they test it themselves." The tribunal continued over the following 3 days, and I found myself called upon repeatedly to clarify details of Dominion doctrine, command structure, and the specific chain of decisions that had authorized the strike on that quiet white station. I answered every question as fully and honestly as I could, understanding that whatever judgment eventually emerged from this process would shape not just my own fate, but the broader relationship between our two civilizations moving forward, a relationship that had begun in violence and misunderstanding, and now depended on whether either side could find a way to establish something more stable in its place. On the 3rd day, a human officer I had not yet met joined the proceedings, introduced to me as Commander Allison Whitfield, the very officer who had commanded the response unit during my original engagement. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions upon learning her identity, a strange combination of dread and an almost desperate curiosity to finally understand, directly from the source, exactly what had guided her decisions during that catastrophic battle. She was not what I expected, though by that point in my journey through human space, I had begun to understand that very little about this species matched my earlier expectations. She was calm, measured in her speech, carrying none of the triumphant satisfaction I might once have anticipated from a commander who had so thoroughly defeated a fleet 3 times the size of her own vessel's crew complement. "Commander Vextara Kol," she said, addressing me directly for the first time, her tone carrying neither hostility nor warmth, simply a kind of careful, professional respect that I found myself grateful for after everything else I had experienced. "I want you to understand something about the engagement between our forces, something I don't believe has been fully communicated to you yet." "I am listening," I said. "You lost 24 ships and their crews," she said. "I want you to know that number was not a foregone conclusion. My vessel was fully capable of ending that engagement in under 30 seconds, with total losses on your side, if I had chosen to deploy at full capability from the very first exchange. I chose not to do that. I gave your fleet multiple opportunities to withdraw, opportunities your leadership chose not to take. Every ship I disabled rather than destroyed represented a deliberate choice on my part, a decision to extend as much restraint as circumstances allowed, even while responding to an attack on a facility filled with people who had done nothing to deserve what happened to them." I absorbed her words slowly, understanding the full weight of what she was telling me. The battle I had experienced as an overwhelming, terrifying defeat had been, from her perspective, a carefully controlled demonstration, calibrated specifically to preserve as many lives as possible on both sides, while still delivering an unmistakable message about the consequences of what we had done. "Why," I asked, genuinely wanting to understand, "would you extend that restraint to an enemy who had just destroyed a facility full of your own people?" Allison considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Because the alternative is becoming the kind of species that responds to atrocity with atrocity," she said. "We have found, across a long history of conflict with many different species, that restraint deployed with clear consequences teaches a lesson far more effectively than total annihilation ever could. Total annihilation ends a threat, certainly, but it teaches nothing to anyone still watching. Restraint, backed by unmistakable capability, teaches every observer exactly where the line exists, and exactly what happens when that line is crossed, without requiring us to become something we don't want to be in the process." I thought of everything I had witnessed since that first engagement, the calm, procedural tone of every human communication, the gardens aboard a station built for administrative purposes, the quiet, patient explanation Grace Lindley had offered during our long journey together, and understood, hearing Allison's words, that all of these things connected to the same underlying principle. Humanity had built a civilization capable of overwhelming force, and had deliberately chosen, again and again, to hold that force in careful reserve, deploying only what circumstances required, precisely because they understood that unrestrained power, however justified its use might feel in any single moment, ultimately corrupted the civilization wielding it. "I have one more question," I said, before the session concluded for the day. "What happens now? To my people, to the border systems we withdrew from? What does your species intend, moving forward?" Allison exchanged a brief glance with Margaret Ashcombe before answering. "That depends largely on choices your leadership makes from this point forward," she said. "We have no interest in continued conflict with the Dominion, provided your forces respect the boundaries that were violated during this engagement. We are not seeking territorial expansion into your space, nor punitive measures beyond what has already occurred as a direct consequence of the attack itself. What we want, more than anything else, is clarity. We want your leadership, and every other species watching this conflict unfold, to understand precisely what triggered this response, and precisely what will trigger it again, should the same violation occur elsewhere, along any border we protect." The tribunal concluded on the 4th day with a formal finding that I was permitted to review in full before my departure from human space. It did not recommend punishment against me personally, beyond what I had already experienced through the loss of my command and the ongoing psychological weight of everything I had witnessed and survived. Instead, the finding focused primarily on establishing a clear, documented record of the events leading to the conflict, intended, as Margaret had explained, to serve as a reference point for every civilization that might one day find itself considering a similar violation against human interests. I read that finding slowly, seated alone in the small quarters provided to me aboard the administrative station, understanding as I did so that I was reading something far more significant than a simple record of a single military engagement. I was reading the foundational document of a new understanding between our two civilizations, one built not on negotiated terms or traded concessions, but on the hard, unambiguous lesson that humanity's restraint, however genuine and considerable, existed alongside a clear and absolute boundary that no calculation of tactical advantage could justify crossing. My return journey to Dominion space took place aboard the same small diplomatic transport that had carried me to New Haven, though Grace Lindley was not assigned to accompany me on the return trip, replaced instead by a quieter, more reserved officer named Peter Aldridge, who spoke only when necessary, respecting what he seemed to understand was a long and difficult period of reflection for me, following everything I had witnessed and learned. I spent much of that journey reviewing the tribunal's findings alongside broader reports that had begun circulating throughout neutral trading networks, describing how various species along both our borders had responded to the conclusion of this conflict. The reaction, as I read through report after report during those quiet days of travel, confirmed everything I had begun to suspect during my time among the humans. This engagement had never truly been contained to a single conflict between two civilizations. It had become, almost immediately, a reference point that every other species in this region now used to recalibrate their own understanding of where humanity's boundaries lay, and what capabilities existed behind those boundaries should they ever be tested. A coalition of smaller species, previously scattered and largely independent trading partners along the outer edges of both Dominion and human territory, issued a joint statement shortly after the tribunal's conclusion, formally establishing what they termed a mutual recognition accord with human authorities, an agreement that explicitly acknowledged and respected the same protected humanitarian boundaries that our own attack had violated so catastrophically. I read the text of that accord with a strange, complicated mixture of emotions, understanding that our failure had inadvertently established a new standard of conduct across an entire region of space, one that would likely persist for generations, shaping how conflicts were conducted long after every officer involved in the original engagement had been forgotten. The Ithane, whose earlier message to our administrative office had first alerted me to the broader consequences rippling outward from our engagement, formalized their withdrawal from several trade agreements with the Dominion during this same period, citing directly, in their official communications, the events of our conflict with humanity as the primary reason for reassessing their long-standing relationship with our empire. I understood, reading their statement, that we had lost something far more significant than a single fleet or a handful of contested border systems. We had lost the confident reputation that had allowed the Dominion to expand unchecked across this region for decades, a reputation built on the assumption that overwhelming force, displayed without restraint, represented the only meaningful measure of a civilization's strength. High Command, in the months following my return, undertook a broader review of Dominion military doctrine, incorporating lessons from the engagement in ways that surprised me, given how thoroughly our leadership had once dismissed any suggestion that our fundamental approach to conflict required reconsideration. New protocols emerged, slowly and with considerable internal resistance, establishing clearer boundaries around what constituted acceptable targets during any future campaign, explicitly prohibiting strikes against clearly identified medical or humanitarian facilities, regardless of tactical advantage such strikes might theoretically offer. I do not know whether these changes reflected genuine moral reconsideration among Dominion leadership, or simply a pragmatic recognition that the cost of crossing such boundaries, at least where humanity was concerned, far exceeded any benefit such actions might provide. As I suspect, if I am honest with myself, that it was primarily the latter, a calculated adjustment, rather than a genuine transformation of the values underlying our expansion. But I found myself, during that period, willing to accept even a purely pragmatic change if it meant fewer crews would face the kind of devastating consequence my own fleet had experienced, and fewer civilian populations would suffer the kind of attack that had started this entire catastrophic sequence of events. I was offered, several months after my return, a position within a newly established Dominion office, tasked specifically with studying human military doctrine and diplomatic protocol, drawing directly on my first-hand experience with their forces and my extended time among their civilian and military populations during the tribunal proceedings. I accepted the position, understanding it as perhaps the only meaningful way remaining to me to ensure that the lessons I had learned through such devastating cost would not simply fade into forgotten history as Dominion leadership moved on to whatever expansion opportunities remained available elsewhere along our other borders. It was during my work in this new office that I encountered, for the final time in this account, a piece of information that clarified something I had wondered about since that very first day, seated on my command deck, watching a single word arrive across an open channel just before the true nature of the vessel I faced revealed itself. I had long wondered, during the months following that engagement, exactly how a single response unit had been positioned so precisely to intercept our fleet's advance, arriving with what had felt, at the time, like impossible foreknowledge of our exact approach. The answer, when I finally found it buried within intelligence reports our new office had gained access to through the expanding diplomatic channels now open between our two civilizations, was almost disappointingly simple, and somehow more unsettling for its simplicity than any dramatic explanation could have been. Humanity maintained standing response protocols along every border where humanitarian and medical facilities operated, protocols that activated automatically the moment sensors confirmed an attack against such a facility, dispatching the nearest available response unit without requiring any additional command authorization beyond the initial confirmation itself. There had been no elaborate intelligence operation tracking our fleet's movements in advance. There had been no dramatic foreknowledge of our specific intentions. There had simply been a system, built carefully over years of consistent policy, designed to ensure that any attack against a protected facility received an immediate, appropriate, and unavoidable response, regardless of which particular officer commanded the offending fleet, regardless of which particular world or system the violation occurred within. We had not provoked a specific personal reaction from an enemy nursing a grudge against our particular empire. We had simply triggered a system, built long before our first contact with humanity, designed to respond identically to any species foolish enough to cross the same boundary. I remember sitting with that realization for a long time after first understanding its full implications, feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite relief, but was perhaps something close to a strange, uncomfortable peace. We had not been specifically targeted out of malice or particular animosity toward the Dominion. We had simply been the latest in what I suspected, based on careful reading between the lines of various historical references our new intelligence access allowed us to glimpse, was a long history of species who had tested this same boundary and received this same measured, unwavering response. I have spent a great deal of time since those events trying to understand exactly what it was we truly woke, back when I gave the order to strike that quiet white station without a second thought for what it broadcasted or who it sheltered. I do not believe, even now, that we woke anger, though anger would have been far easier to understand, far easier to categorize, within everything the Dominion had learned about conflict across its long history of expansion. Anger burns hot and eventually exhausts itself. What we woke instead burned cold, patient, and utterly without end, a calm and settled certainty that some boundaries exist not because a species fears crossing them, but because a species has decided, long ago and with total conviction, exactly who they intend to remain, regardless of what provocation or opportunity for advantage might tempt them to become something else. I think often about the difference between the reputation humanity carried before our attack and the reality we eventually discovered lay beneath it. Our intelligence had described them as soft, sentimental, prone to the kind of internal disagreement and emotional disorder that made conquest of such species relatively straightforward, provided sufficient force was displayed early enough in any campaign to break their collective resolve. I understand now that this softness was never weakness at all. It was simply the visible surface of a civilization that had made a deliberate choice, generations ago perhaps, to prioritize gentleness and gardens and quiet administrative stations over the constant, aggressive display of capability that had defined every moment of Dominion existence for as long as our recorded history extended. That gentleness, I came to understand through months of study and reflection, was never the absence of strength. It was strength held carefully in reserve, deployed only when circumstances made its use unavoidable, and deployed then with a precision and restraint that revealed far more about the true depth of that strength than any constant, aggressive posturing ever could have. We had spent our entire existence as an empire believing that strength required constant demonstration to remain meaningful, that any capability not actively displayed was capability wasted or forgotten. Humanity had shown us, through the quiet, unhurried destruction of more than half our fleet, that strength held in reserve, deployed only at the precise moment and to the precise degree circumstances required, was a far more terrifying demonstration of true capability than anything we had ever managed to project through our own doctrine of constant, visible aggression. I resigned from my position within the Dominion's new diplomatic office nearly 2 years after these events concluded, though I remained available for consultation whenever new questions arose regarding human doctrine or the increasingly stable, if still cautious, relationship developing between our two civilizations. I chose, in my remaining years of service, to dedicate myself instead to training new officers entering our fleet, ensuring that every cadet who passed through my instruction understood clearly and completely the lesson our empire had learned at such devastating cost. I taught them that there exist certain boundaries in every civilization capable of true strength that exist not as tactical constraints imposed by fear of consequence, but as fundamental expressions of what that civilization has decided it will and will not become, regardless of any advantage crossing such a boundary might theoretically provide. I taught them, too, about the single word that had opened our engagement with humanity so long ago, a word I have never fully stopped thinking about in all the years since I first heard it delivered across that narrow, private channel. Confirmed. Not a threat delivered in anger, not a boast delivered in pride, simply a calm, procedural acknowledgement that a violation had been verified, and that a measured, deliberate response was now, as a matter of settled principle rather than emotional reaction, entirely unavoidable. As I understand now, in ways I could never have understood before that first devastating engagement, that this is perhaps the most important lesson any expanding civilization can learn about the galaxy it hopes to navigate. Somewhere among the quiet, unassuming, seemingly soft and sentimental species scattered across every border, there may exist a strength held so completely in reserve that it becomes almost invisible, right up until the exact moment a specific and unforgivable boundary is crossed. When that moment arrives, whatever restraint had characterized every previous interaction with that species vanishes instantly, replaced by a response calibrated not to the observer's fear, but to the precise and unwavering standards that civilization has quietly maintained, sometimes for generations, waiting patiently for a test they had hoped, but never fully expected, they would never actually need to answer. We bombed a human hospital, believing we understood exactly what kind of adversary waited on the other side of that quiet, unassuming border. We had no idea, in that fateful moment, exactly what we had awakened, no understanding of the calm, patient, and utterly immovable resolve that lay hidden beneath every gentle garden and every soft, sentimental reputation we had so badly misjudged. I carry that lesson with me now, in every remaining year of my service, and I have made it my final purpose to ensure that every officer who serves beneath my instruction understands it completely, long before they ever find themselves standing on a command deck, giving an order they believe to be routine, with no idea at all of the sleeping strength their careless decision is about to call fully, finally, and irrevocably awake.